Module 3, Topic B, Competitive Cities and Sports Spectacles. Now in that first topic within this module, we looked at the relationship between sports spectacles, mega events and international relations, and specifically soft power. Now we're going to take the analysis to a different level. Rather than looking at the national and international dimensions, we're going to look at those that start at the city level, from the urban level. So we're looking at competitive cities and how they relate and how they use sports spectacles, those major mega events. Now that's not to say that these city-based analyses aren't related to national and international relations. As you'll see, clearly they are, but we're looking at them from a different level of analysis, from the city level rather than the national or international level. And as it says here, over the past 50 years or so, the function and structure of cities has really changed as we've gone into what we'd call a post-industrial economic system. And we have to think about that in relation to how sports spectacles play a role within the post-industrial city, and how sports spectacles and sporting mega events help to shape cities, their function, their structure, and how they will increasingly do so in the future. So really we're looking at that relationship between sports spectacle and urban formation within the contemporary context. But let's move on. Here's the outline. We're looking at some theoretical points in relation to networks and hierarchies of global cities. We're going to look at how the neoliberal city within that context of post-industrial economic formations has played out, what the contemporary city looks like and what its function is, how it's linked, and we're going to concentrate largely on the Olympic Games. But the Olympic Games is just an example, maybe the most high-profile example, but it's just an example of a sport mega event. And so we're going to look at the neoliberal Olympics and how that is related to the creation of spectacular spaces and the role of legacy within contemporary Olympic Games. And fourthly, we're going to focus specifically on Rio 26 and the bid process and what it's stated within its bid materials about its Olympic legacy and their various forms of urban transformation that we're expecting to go on in Rio. So really what we're looking at is how the Olympic Games fits into this understanding of the contemporary city and its relationship to sports spectacles. Let's get going then. Networks and hierarchies of global cities. Cities as the command centres of the world economic system. Now, there is a lot of sociological globalization theory work on this, and I'm just going to give you a brief and basic overview, but hopefully it'll be useful so you can see why the contemporary city is like it is. Now, according to Saskia Sassen, there are a small number of what she calls global cities, that they are the hubs or the command centres of the contemporary global economy. And she would argue, and this is why it's in orange there, that rather than national interests dominating the world economy, it's in fact the interests and the influence of cities that has taken over. So cities now, as hubs of the world economy, are more important than nations. Now that might seem a bit odd because cities are located within nations, but what she's saying is the networks and the relationships and the interconnections between these cities is what keeps the world economic system going, rather than the relationships between the nations, which really how the modern or the economic system prior to the one that we've got at the moment is. So it's very much a city-based world system. And she identifies different levels or a hierarchy of world cities, of global cities, ones with more significance and more influence than the others. And they're alpha plus plus, alpha plus alpha, or alpha minus cities. These are the top level cities, the most important ones. And Guinness, for example, identifies that the two major alpha plus plus cities are New York and London. They're the real key hubs of the contemporary global world system. Others would throw Tokyo in there as well. This is what Saskin was really saying in this book here, that it was London, New York and Tokyo. But then you've got a whole list of other cities that go down the hierarchy, and the hierarchy is in terms of their importance, their significance within the world economic system. Now, what makes this, what determines a city being more significant higher up this hierarchy than another? Now, in many ways it's due to this, the issue of financialization of the world economy. And you may have seen this in other classes, or you may have come across this process of financialization, but it's something key that we need to think about. The argument goes that financial markets, stock exchange, futures, mortgages, investment structures play an increasingly important role within the world economic system. So it's that financial mechanisms and those financial channels, and it's the financial services sector through which profit is largely accumulated. So if you think about what Epstein was referring to here, the financialization of the world economy becomes driven largely by investment interests, stock exchange derivatives, futures, mortgages, etc., rather than the straightforward production and consumption of material goods. It's less about that and more about the financial structures behind those processes that people are really gambling on within the financial markets. So it's financial markets which are the propelling, the motor of the world economic system rather than material production. Now that's a key difference if you think about it. And so the financialization of the world economy makes the financial sector ever more important. And it's cities which are at the hub of the financial sector, because it's in cities where financial transactions, where financial markets exist. The major cities within today's global economic system are post-industrial rather than industrial. And we talked about this distinction previously, but let me just go over it again. An industrial city would be New York in 1934, where mass manufacturing of material products, and here you can see the various factories and the smokestacks that demonstrate or signify the industrial city, was still an important part of the city life. Whereas today in post-industrial New York, it's a space of finance. It's a post-industrial enterprise space based on financial services and information-based think work. So there's a radical difference between the industrial and post-industrial city. And today's major significant alpha plus global cities are post-industrial cities based around the financial services sector. So if we look at those, the command centers of the global economy are financial hubs more than anything else. They may not have any material industrial production left in them, but they do have the financial services sector, the stock markets, the mortgage brokers, the insurance brokers, etc., etc. So you can see how the city has changed its function and what predominates within it. So finance is clearly key within the global system, and the cities that are the hubs of it, the command centres. But it's not the only thing. And here we can see Kearney's Global Cities Index for 2014, New York, London, Paris, Tokyo, Hong Kong, Los Angeles, etc. And they've come up with five different categories for how they identify the most important global city: business activity, human capital, information exchange, cultural experience, and that's key for us, and political engagement. Add those things up on an index, and that's what you get, the hierarchy of cities, from 1, New York, through 20, Buenos Aires. And I would ask you to look at these in more detail, the 5 different measures: business, human, information, cultural and political forms. They're the dimensions that are key in deciding which cities come to the fore within the global economy. And as I said, cultural experience is perhaps key for us, because it's not just financial services, the finance sector that determines the importance of a city. There has to have other things around it that support the finance system, that make the global city truly significant and important in all these different dimensions. And when it comes to cultural experience, it's diverse attractions, including major sporting events. So while they may not, you can't become a global city just by having the Olympic Games. However, the Olympic Games would help you tip over, or help tip the balance, help make you a global city. Perhaps if you're on that alpha plus, trying to get to alpha plus plus, or trying to further up that hierarchy of cities by getting the Olympic Games or a similar type global event, that tells the world that you are a significant player culturally as well as in terms of business and finance. So all these things go together, and that's one reason why these major cities want things such as global sports spectacles such as the Olympics or World Cup games. They want to demonstrate to the world that they are in fact a global city. Now I think the interesting thing is here that although there's the hierarchy today, there's an emerging cities index as well. So they're projecting that over the next 20 to 50 years, 10 to 20 years according to this index, things are going to change. The global cities today and the index today may not be reflected as being the same in 20 years' time. And here you've got cities in the developing world who are aspiring global cities. They want to get into the higher echelons of city significance. And Beijing is there as 12th. You've got Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, and various cities within developing economies. Now they're looking to sports spectacles as ways to propel them into this top 20 band, and maybe one of them will. But that's something to think about, that the cities and the index doesn't stay the same. It's constantly worked and reworked according to the way the economies change and the global economic system changes as well. Now, there are cities, global cities, there's a network and hierarchy to it, and Kearney again comes up with the different forms from A+, all these different forms of global city, and they tend to interact with each other. So largely speaking, the size of the city, they have the largest forms of interaction and relationship and interconnection with cities of a similar size. And so, as Sasson said, there are distinct global networks of cities, or what she called a transnational urban system, an urban flow and communication and network of relationships. And these take the various forms. There's investment networks, flows of capital between the various nodes, the various points, global cities. And investment capital from one global city tends to move to the other to invest in other global cities. Similarly, professional networks, there's flows of people. You may know some people yourself, or you may in your own careers move from one global city to another along a professional network, and that's becoming increasingly popular, or prevalent I should say. And then there's corporate networks, flows of organisations. The same transnational organisation will have offices, one in Rio, one in Mumbai, one in London, and so there's linkages across that organisational network, and there may be flows of people that go across that organisational network. So this urban system, this linkages between cities, also, and it shouldn't be forgotten, there's flows of capital, there's flows of people, and there's flows of organisations across these various lines. They're not just arbitrary connections, they're linked in particular ways. And here you go, here's some examples of these linkages. Kearney again looks at the linkages between alpha plus plus cities, alpha and alpha minor cities. And as I said earlier, these cities tend to interact with the cities at the same level the most. Of course they interact with other levels of cities, but the level at which they're positioned tends to speak to the various interconnections. So there's alpha plus city and beta cities as well. And we can find Washington, I believe. Washington is an alpha city there. So it has a fair way to go to get into the top echelon. And if we look for Baltimore, Baltimore is somewhere along here, I believe. It's relatively low down within the world city hierarchy, let's put it that way. And an important thing to think about is this, that there's these interconnections, these networks and flows between these global cities, but oftentimes this leads to local disconnection. And Sasson says this here, there's a disconnection between the hinterland or the national economy. The hinterland is the land behind the city, within the nation. And so, as I said earlier, city economies are becoming more important than national economies in the workings of the global system. And this demonstrates that there is this disconnection between the city and the nation in which it's located, as it has all these various interconnections with other cities, other command hubs around the world. So what this means is, and this is what we're getting to within this particular section, is that there's a form of competitive urbanism that goes on within the world economy. So cities are vying against each other for capital, for organisations and for people, amongst other things. There's only a finite amount of capital to be invested around the world, a finite amount of educated people to work within organisations, and a finite number of high-level organisations that cities want to attract to have headquarters there. So there's all these different forms that cities now compete against other cities to acquire them. And there you go, cultural capital is an important part as well. There are only a finite number of museums, a finite number of major events that cities can attract to help substantiate their status as world cities. And that needs to be thought of. So cities are competing against them within this world economic system. It's a competitive urbanism, or an inter-urban competition, that is an important part of the contemporary global economy, that competition between cities for them to gain status and, to make sure of their place on the global city index. Because it's not just, as we said previously, it's not just the finance sector. Of course that's important. It's these other things as well that they're competing against. And so hopefully you can see where I'm going with this, because sports spectacles are part of that cultural experience. And so these cities vie against each other for the sports spectacle, the hosting of sports spectacles and major events, because in doing so it improves their cultural capital against their competitors within the world system of cities. So this is the interurban competition we're talking about, that struggle between post-industrial cities for these various resources or forms of capital through which it sustains itself, thrives or declines. Because if a city becomes low in one of these forms of capital, one of these sources of resources, it will be on the decline. However, if a city is ambitious, aggressive, and it secures these different forms of capital, then it will thrive. So cities are constantly trying to compete with each other and compete with their nearest adversaries to get up that city hierarchy. Moving on then, what we're looking at here is something called the entrepreneurial city. And this is the new type of city governance, a new way that the city is administered and is structured according to the new global economy and the economy in which there's interurban competition. And the argument is that within the entrepreneurial city, the spectacular redevelopment of urban space is key to making sure that spectacular urban redevelopment is key to maintaining that the city is competitive against its adversaries within the global city hierarchy. So the entrepreneurial city is a feature of this, neoliberal capitalist societies. And I'm going to get to neoliberalism again and talk about what that means. But effectively what it's saying is that cities have to be entrepreneurial. They have to think about how they can generate capital from various different means in order to maintain their competitive status within the world economy and hierarchy of cities. So that means there's a constant need to redevelop and redesign and rework cities, be they big cities or small cities, to ensure that that redevelopment leads to their advancement, that they thrive and they don't fall by the wayside within that interurban competition. Now this has come about, this changing how the cities operate and their function, because of a number of things. And this is quite a wordy slide, or quite, let's just go through it and I'll see if you can get it. It's all quite straightforward, you just got to think through the relationships. Now there's been a definite political and economic evolution of cities between the industrial and the post-industrial, or what we'll call the neoliberal entrepreneurial city. The industrial city was all about mass manufacturing and the generation of a tax base that the city governors could use to manage the welfare of the citizens. And the tax base came from the very healthy industrial employment base that generated the tax that helped pay for city services, etc. Now, that was in the industrial city, but when the industries decline, there's a decline and relocation in mass manufacturing, and we have the emergence of what's called the deindustrializing city, a declining population, shrinking urban workforce, and therefore a diminishing tax base. So the city doesn't generate, because it's no longer an industrial space in the same level it was, it doesn't generate the same type of public funding to service its citizens. So there's reduced revenues and city budgets. There's a crisis within the city because it's no longer generating the same type of monies for public services that it did previously. Therefore, there's a public service retrenchment and commercial privatization. This is what the neoliberal post-industrial city is all about. Retrenchment means basically reduction. So there's been a reduction in public services within cities because there's no longer the forms of the public money is available to pay for the same type of services that you could have paid for in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and even into the 80s. But in the 90s and since, there's been a reduction in public services that's been linked to this reduction in city revenues and budgets. And there's been a privatization oftentimes of what were previously public services. So rather than getting them for free as part of your public services that the city provided you, now you may have to pay a fee for these various services. And so that's what the post-industrial or neoliberal city is, that relies much more heavily on commercial privatization of services and in fact is characterized by a reduction in public services as well as a privatization of those that still exist. So there's a very different city form, and the city is also in crisis because it has to find a way of generating, if you like, its revenues and budgets from somewhere. Instead of looking to mass manufacturing, it has to look elsewhere. But first, just to recap, here's the contrast between these two models of city city governance, really. There's a managerial city, that's the social welfare city, where the style of governance was to manage money to better the public services, to provide public welfare for the citizens. This was owned by the public, and the sites of it were public spaces and services. So the role of city governance was to manage public spaces and services for the public welfare of its citizens. That's in that model of the city. Now, as we said, that was fine when industries generated mass amounts of tax revenues and tax bases, and there was a healthy population that created various forms of commercial and residential taxes for the city. But when that declined, what happened? The city governance became more entrepreneurial, looking for other ways to make money, in that way entrepreneurial. The object of governing was for commercial profit, to generate the monies through which the city could be run. the ownership of these commercial spaces and services that were generating the money became increasingly privatized. So the city becomes much more entrepreneurial in the way that it engages, how it governs its population and the spaces within it. There's the shift. And that's what we've seen over the last, 50 years, that shift from managerial to entrepreneurial forms of city governance. And these are linked to the rise of this neoliberalism. And this is a form of economic model that's rooted in a particular politics, but fundamentally it's an economic model that says this, and this is the justification that many people use for moving from here to here. Number one, a neoliberal philosophy would say you don't waste public money on social welfare, social engineering programs that this type of governance would. Rather, you retrench or reduce those programs. Why do you do that? Number two, to provide individuals with more money in their pockets. You lessen their tax burden so they have the freedom to use that money in the way they see fit, rather than for subsidizing social welfare, public service programs. Now, in order to, you're lessening these social programs, so what you have to do is develop a corporate or business-friendly climate to stimulate economic growth, because from that economic growth, capital, wealth and success will trickle down to the rest of the economy. This is the argument that it goes. So creating a business-friendly environment where business and commercial interests thrive, creates jobs, creates profits, creates tax, and in that way it takes over, or it replaces that high level of mass industrial tax base that the industrial city was all about. So number four, you encourage the commercial privatization of all aspects of society, including the public services that previously the city was responsible for. So there you have privatized public services are now part of this neoliberal system. And you let the free market become the regulator of economic, social development. We don't have costly programs that are drain on society or that drain on public monies. They're privatized, and if they don't function, and if they're not efficient, and if they're not profitable, they don't last. And so what you're doing here is providing productive individuals with increased freedom and opportunity to cultivate their own lives. This is the core tenet. So within this system, what you're doing, you're reducing the tax burden, increasing the privatization of spaces and services, and so that the strong, healthy, commercially viable individuals and organisations survive, and those that don't, they don't survive. This is another way of looking at it. It's the same thing. This is the trickle-down economic model that's at the heart of that neoliberal way of philosophy, and this graphic somewhat captures it. But what's saying here is capitalist investors within a city create commercial opportunities. They create businesses, they privatise services, and in that way what they do is they stimulate economic growth, job creation, encouraging consumption, and both of those things help to increase the tax revenue of the city. Corporate tax, sales tax, individual tax through consumption and job creation. So by providing a business-friendly, privatising culture within a city, you're stimulating growth and creating this in order to increase the tax revenue and make sure the city remains afloat. It has a significant amount of public monies coming in through taxation as a result of this privatised commercial growth. That is the argument. So wealth trickles down to everybody, to people who it creates jobs for, and to the rest of us who benefit from the services that are now funded by the creation of this tax base that it feeds the public coffers. So that's the theory, that's the philosophy. And so neoliberalism is at the core of this rise of this entrepreneurial city governance, that's a shift from managerialism to entrepreneurial based forms of governance. So a move away from welfare to commercially oriented objectives. The city now is governing a city is less about the direct welfare of its citizens and perhaps more about encouraging a business privatized commercial friendly climate that allows this type of economic growth to be stimulated in order to lead to the generation of those forms of taxation and public monies. And as a result, there's a replacement of the citizen with the consumer as the focal point of urban leadership. What urban administrators want to do is encourage consumption and the consumer within their cities, because that's what matters. And many authorities seem now more interested in providing consumption spaces and opportunities rather than public services, because public services are a drain on public monies, but consumption spaces and opportunities can directly contribute to the tax base and therefore help to fund the reduced but still in existence public services that the city does still maintain. They may be reduced, but they still need to be paid for. How you do that? By creating various forms of sites of consumption within the city. So another way of looking at it, this is what the city historically has done, has been responsible for all these various types of services. And the argument is that now, within the post-industrial city, the retrenchment city, the entrepreneurial city, there has been either a privatization or a reduction in these types of public services and spaces. They've either been drastically reduced or they've been privatized. And that's happened over the course of your lifetime, and increasingly tends to, that public services within the cities are becoming either privatized or they're being reduced. Now, let's move on a bit, but this is the trickle-down philosophy, another way of speaking to this understanding as well. But look at it, it may clarify in more terms how the trickle-down works. Because it is important that you understand this and these relationships. You don't have to agree with them, because trickle-down economics, neoliberal approaches to entrepreneurial governments are contested. Some people don't agree with them, but they're the dominant way of organising cities within the contemporary world economy, and such that Feinstein and Judd call this the new urbanism. Cities are becoming spaces for consumption. That's primarily what they are. Once cities prospered as places of industrial production, now they are spaces of post-industrial consumption, or post-industrial spaces for consumption. And clearly that's a key difference, but that's how the city has changed. And consumption spaces and experiences are now the motor or engine of economic growth within cities. It's not mass industrial production, it's those specific sites of consumption that help to generate the capital, the profit, the tax base for a city. And here are some of the ways that this happens, because the argument is that cities have to be spectacularly reinvented into spaces of consumption. And there are different types of spaces of consumption within a city. And I'm going to go to the next slide first and go back to this one. There's living spaces have been spectacularly reinvented and redeveloped. Cities and the housing stock within cities, much of which has been privatized with these residential developments to try and attract young, affluent people to move to the city. So living spaces is a key form of spectacular reinvention. And by spectacular, what I'm pointing to there is that this is very attractive, very appealing, high scale, attractive to potential habitants for the city. So living spaces is a key one. Public spaces is another key one. Recreation sites, spaces for recreation within the city. This is the redeveloped Grant Park in Chicago, are an important place to try and appeal, and you have to spectacularly reinvent them, make them appealing sites for recreation to the same type of people that you want to attract as new inhabitants and affluent inhabitants to the city. Because if you don't have inhabitants, the city's a ghost town. It hasn't got a tax base residentially, commercially, or in terms of consumption. So these two go hand in hand, as do these other things. Let's go back to this slide. Retail spaces. It's not just good having shops. You have to have these high-tech, very attractive, appealing, spectacularly reinvented shopping sites. Festival sites, festival spaces where performances, public performances in open-air settings normally, like Covent Garden in London, and there's places in Baltimore, I'm sure there's places in DC and New York, where people go and congregate and gather to watch different types of performance, much of which is free, but it attracts people there, and oftentimes they're near shopping sites or retail spaces. Leisure spaces, again, high-tech, very appealing entertainment sites to go and watch plays, films, you name it, what they might be. But also linked to that within the reinvention of the city are museums and what is called heritage spaces. So as you're redeveloping or reinventing a city, you have to make sure that all these various components are there to make sure it has the cultural capital to be able to attract people and make it a viable and important global city. Hotel spaces has to have a solid number of hotels to attract people, of the right type of hotels, spectacularly reinvented hotels. And here, this is sports spaces, where it gets to us. Many cities only define themselves as world or global or significant cities once they have a major sports space, a major sporting event site where they can host global sporting events. So that's a key thing as well that goes into this spectacular reinvention. And we have had around the world the development of ever more spectacular sports spaces for cities who are vying against, be it Dallas, vying against Amsterdam, vying against London, to produce the most spectacular sports site or sport event site. So what all this speaks to then is, if the city has been reduced to a space of privatized consumption, then this speculative construction of place, there's Harvey's key words. He's saying that what we have then is this speculative, which means it's a gamble to try and redevelop and reinvent a city. So it's the reinvention, the speculative reinvention of place to try and make it competitive within that inter-urban competition. So cities, to keep up, have to continually invest in that speculative construction of place to try and keep up with their competitors within that global world system of cities. So they constantly reinventing themselves along these lines to get better spaces of consumption, spaces of leisure, festival, you name it, living spaces, recreation spaces. There's a constant a constant striving to better the city in order to keep up. So that speculative construction of place is an ongoing process. And what Harvey and others would argue that people think it leads to, if you're successful in your speculative construction of place, is this: the attraction or retention of major corporations considering locating within the city. So if you reinvent your city appropriately, people want to locate their organizations there, or their corporations there, to have major office buildings there, because they want their people to be working in what is perceived to be an attractive environment. So you do, number one, you can attract and retain educated workforce that, number one, these major corporations needs. And so city governors now have to recognise that they have to make their cities appealing to the workforce that is going to be needed by the corporations who are going to be located, they hope, within the city. So there are two major impetuses behind it. And the third one is this, that you want to make your city, as a site of various forms of consumption and experience, attractive to tourists, both internal, or from the outskirts of the city coming into it, and external external tourists, those that come to the city to stay for a few days to experience and to be tourists within it. So of all these things, a successful reinvention or redevelopment of the city on a spectacular level would lead to these things. So it's for those reasons that urban governance now has been reduced within the urban neoliberal or entrepreneurial philosophy. It's all about the speculative construction of place. And what we have are a series of global place wars where these various cities are fighting against each other to get the best resources, the best spaces, the best stadia, the best museums, that they can attract those people, be it the corporations, be it the people that are going to work for the corporations, or be it the various forms of tourists. So that's what they're competing for within these global place wars. And within those global place wars, sport is a key factor. And people have argued, many people have argued that, and I've mentioned this before, that to become a world-class city, sport plays a key role in that, and specifically the hosting of what are called hallmark events or truly global mega events. Now there are a hierarchy of sporting events, the top of which is probably the Olympic Games, then the World Cup, but there are others as well, are other hallmark events that help to distinguish a city as an important site. Now why they compete for these events is for this. One, to demonstrate involvement in inter-urban competition. They're involved in this competition. They're a player within the world system of urban or cities. They're not just a bystander. They're getting involved and trying to compete and trying to be aspirationally mobile up that hierarchy of the global city index. Number two, to utilise existing facilities and infrastructure. Maybe there's been a stadium that was built and they have to demonstrate it's being used, so they attract an event to that city in order to use that facility or infrastructure. It can also be used to justify investment in new facilities and infrastructure. We're going to try and get the World Cup or the Olympic Games as a justification and an impetus and a reason to develop the public transport system in this city, for example. And also, fourthly, there's a cyclical nature or a knock-on effect that if to demonstrate that you've successfully hosted a mega event, it helps you to get other ones. So you have to get on that conveyor belt. Look, I've done the European Championships. That demonstrates that we could do the World Cup or the Olympic Games. So if you're going to compete, you have to get involved. And so that's another impetus for trying to do so. So these are all the various reasons why cities do get involved in national and international high-level events. And as Waite says here, it's a key organising spectacular urban space for sport competitions. So what he's saying effectively is that if you reinvent the city for the purpose of hosting major sporting events, that's a really important way of attracting capital and people in the period of inter-urban competition. It's a key thing to do to win those battles with your rivals, those city rivals in that form of inter-urban competition. So getting an Olympic Games puts you ahead of your rivals. It demonstrates to the world. Getting the World Cup quarterfinal or a series of games within the World Cup or the Rugby World Cup, whatever it might be, demonstrates a particular status and has a knock-on effect, it's hoped, for attracting capital and people away from your city rivals. So that's the philosophy behind it. But let's think very quickly in this section, before we move on, about how spectacular sporting spaces are created. And here we're going to turn to specifically the Olympics, and because it's the most high profile, but this goes to kind of down the food chain of sporting events, but the Olympics are just where the most money is invested and it's most high profile. But what we see within the reinvention of cities to create what's called spectacular Olympic spaces is a combination of two things: a usage of built heritage, the built environment that's already part of the city, and perhaps which the city is already known for, and innovative forms of design. If you combine those together, you're creating spectacular Olympic spaces, spectacular sports spaces associated with the city. And I would argue that this is kind of true of many types of events, but here's some Olympic examples. Go back to Barcelona 1992, the Summer Olympics. Here at the Montjuïc diving swimming pool facility, so people would dive off and they would see Gaudi's Sagrada Familia in the background. And I don't think there's ever been a more stunning backdrop using the built heritage, i.e. Sagrada Familia, and the rest of the cityscape of Barcelona. You're too young to remember it, but it was a truly magnificent spectacle to watch, and it brought the cityscape of Barcelona to the attention of the watching world. But there was also innovative design, and if we look at this now, the Geordie Sports Palace looks rather kind of old-fashioned to us now, but at the time it was hugely innovative. Moving on, the built heritage of Sydney 2000, the Sydney Harbour Bridge. There's used with the Olympic rings there. This is part of the opening ceremony. Sydney Opera House here. So these are part of Sydney's built heritage that are used within the Olympic spectacle. But also we have innovative design, Stadium Australia, and it was at the time demonstrating to the world that Australia was a traditional, it had heritage, but also a very modern, high-tech, innovative society, as demonstrated by this magnificent stadium. Moving on, the built heritage of Athens 2004, and there's numerous examples of that, but here's the men's road race using the Acropolis as a backdrop in Athens, and counter that in terms of innovative design with the Olympic Velodrome, which is, and the name of the architect escapes me, but it's a very avant-garde, innovative, high-tech, modern design, I think you'll agree. Then, again, another cycling example, but here's the Great Wall of China, and part of the road race, men's and women's, for the cycling in Beijing 2008, went along and used the backdrop of the Great Wall as part, giving some history, depth and heritage to the event. And you counter that with the famous water cube, which was hugely innovative in its design and became an iconic, along with the Bird's Nest Olympic Stadium, these became iconic symbols of the entire games, and therefore of Beijing, the city, and China, the nation. And then in London in 2012, typical bad weather, I'll point out, but there we go. This is Horse Guards Parade, where the Trooping of the Colour takes place, which is a ceremony involving the Queen. I think it's normally in May or June, but they put temporary stands up and use this backdrop of London with the London Eye here and various typical Georgian buildings to play beach volleyball. So here's the heritage and here's the Olympic site. Position that against the incredible facility that was the aquatic centre there. Zaha Hadid, I believe, was the architect for this, and it was hugely innovative and award-winning design that positioned against the heritage of London more generally. And really, the point that I'm trying to get to is this, and I'll get back to that slide there, is that when cities involve themselves in an Olympic Games that demands that speculative construction of spectacular place, a lot of times what they do, they need to rely on both built heritage to demonstrate history and innovative design to demonstrate that the city, the nation, is in fact a developed, high-tech, thriving and at the forefront of the economy of nations. It's not lagging behind. It doesn't simply rely on history. It's a combination of these two things. And so that's why, and for that reason, that's how people get involved in speculative construction of place through the creation of spectacular space in these particular ways, and the Olympics being a key part and a key example of that. So let's turn to the Olympics in ever more detail and what we'll call the neoliberal Olympics, because the neoliberal form of the Olympics, that's an entrepreneurial motor for urban growth, relies on the creation of those speculative, spectacular spaces. And so we're going to look at that, and also we're going to look at how that plays into the Olympic movement's demand for legacies. And I'll speak to precisely what I mean by that. So, starting with the neoliberal Olympics, the Olympics in its present form can be considered neoliberal for the following reason. Basically, it involves vast amounts of public money. We're talking about in the tens of billions to host an Olympic Games now, of those public monies that are used for speculative construction of events or places. So it's all with a speculation, it's a gamble that we invest all this public money into these events, these places, these services, the infrastructure, with the anticipation that doing so will be beneficial to the city and its population in both the short and the long term. If you think about that, it's a great example of what we're talking about, that speculative construction of place. And it's speculative construction of spectacular Olympic place. That's what it's all about, and that's why it's neoliberal, because there's an assumption that there's going to be a trickle-down effect from that investment to the rest of the population in multiple different ways. So that $1 billion, it's for infrastructure, services, environment and image, and these are identified within your reading as some of the benefits. So the complex urban infrastructure required to host a major event is viewed as being an important stepping stone for further economic development. So oftentimes an Olympic Games brings with it considerable infrastructure redevelopment. So it could be the telephone system, it could be the sewage system, the road system, the mass transit system, the railways, the subways, etc. So that's one of the benefits. Secondly, the infrastructure is viewed as an important resource or amenity for those within the city. So it's a good thing for the city inhabitants to have this, both during the Games but also after. There's legacies of the Games for the people who live in the city and also for the potential tourists as well. Hosting events, this is number 3, contributes to business and economic growth. So it's thought to bring in a considerable amount of money in terms of investments needed for the infrastructure, for building the various facilities and resources and amenities linked to the game. So there's an economic growth factor that goes on from hosting the event. And it's number 4, very much a high-profile statement on the city's a high-profile statement on the city's success or status. By getting the Olympics, you're demonstrating to the world that you have made it as a world or a global city. It's an expression of how far the city has come by being awarded the hosting of the Games. So that's the number of ways that it's thought to benefit the city. And in 2012, Goldman Sachs came up with this report about the economics of the Olympics. They identified short-term benefits, specifically around the expenditure or the consumption of Olympic-related goods and services, but also linked to secondary spending. So people that were there to spend on the Olympics were also spending on their accommodation, their food, etc., etc. And all of this brought short-term benefits to the city by having the Olympics there. But there were also long-term benefits they identified. So the promotion of the city to attract tourists and investors, upgrades in facilities and infrastructure of the city that came, from the hosting of the Games, that speculative construction of the city, of the Olympic places, led to long-term benefits after the Games were long gone. And so it's neoliberal, the Olympics, in as much as we can see the trickle-down effect working here. So all that public, and there is a bit of private investment, but most of it is public investment in creating the Olympic spectacle. It's linked to urban redevelopment, job creation, consumption stimulus, tourist stimulus, and even the stimulation of sport, because people becoming more interested in sport. So all these trickle-down effects are thought to be derived from hosting those Olympic Games. But, and as you can guess, the Olympics, the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, they want cities to be viable, they want cities to derive considerable short-term benefit, but they want to look beyond the short term. They're really interested, from about 1992 onwards, they really want cities to look to the long-term benefits that are derived from hosting the Games. So they're looking for the legacy effects and legacy strategies that cities put in place prior to the Games. So it's not just a 2-week window on the world for cities, they have enduring impacts on the city, the region and even the nation. And so that's what the IOC look for when they're considering bids for these Games. So what type of legacies, I hear you say? Now in one of your readings it all talks about Olympic legacy. And here Jacques Rogge, then the president of the IOC in 2013, said, "It's a great opportunity when you host the Olympics to capture worldwide attention, but each host city has a unique set of environmental, social and economic legacies that potentially can have a huge and significant effect, as I said, on community, region and nation." But what are these legacies? And this comes from this Olympic legacy document, so it's from the IOC. There are sporting legacies, social legacies, environmental, urban and economic. Now, I'm expecting you to read that document. It's a lot of images, but there's some text in there that will give you some details on each of these. But very briefly, I'm going to go over each one of them. Sporting legacies. Quite obviously, if you host the Olympics, one legacy is state-of-the-art sports facilities. Now, they're great to have, but what they can be used for is to encourage sport and promote sport at the elite level and the mass participation level. So the IOC tends to look for both. It doesn't simply care about elite, it cares about mass participation as well. Social legacies, here it is, and here's the Queen parachuting in during the Olympic ceremony of London 2012, and what the IOC says is that the Olympic Games cultural programme, that includes the Olympic opening and closing ceremonies and many other things, provides a really good opportunity to celebrate the host city's culture and to embrace that culture and to hopefully lead to expressions of national pride, belonging, inclusivity and a sense of belonging. So they're hoping one social legacy of the Olympics is to bring the nation together. And so things like this hopefully lead to bringing together the British population, and that's what that's supposed to signify. So that's the social legacy. The environmental legacy, and this is a key thing to the modern Olympics, who are very clear that they are sensitive to environmental issues in all their documentation. So how do they show their commitment and the various forms of environmental legacy? Number one is the creation of Olympic parks that regenerate open space for public use and enjoyment. This is the London Olympic Park. Secondly, they use new technologies, new energy sources, recycled material. I don't know why there's two E's there. Recycled material, more environmentally friendly transit system. So there's an environmental knock-on that was developed for the Olympics that has a benefit to the host environment post-Olympics as well. Urban legacy. As I've talked about up to this point, there are a number of ways that the hosting the Olympics transforms through investment the structure and experience of the city. Infrastructure enhancements, mass transit systems, etc. Sewage. you name it, telephone lines, communication systems, all different ways that the infrastructure of the city can be enhanced in order to host the Olympics, and they have a knock-on effect afterwards. But as simple as beautification, as Horse Guards Parade again, the cities tend to have a great overhaul. They tend to be renovated in parts, and those that are dilapidated, the buildings that need to be spruced up, brought to modern standards, that tends to happen, and the look of them, the look of the city and the feel of the city tends to be improved because the world is looking. But a second form of urban legacies, and perhaps most importantly, is this notion of urban redevelopment and regeneration. Now, the IOC tends to like this. They like the fact that in recent times, certainly since Barcelona 1992, many of the Olympic bids, the successful ones, have been focused on the regeneration of previously unused or disused land. This is London 2012, and this is, I think they called it the Fridge Mountain. It was disused fridges, and it was a derelict land that was poisoned, and it had to be remediated and it had to be cleaned up in order to create this, the Olympic Park. And here this was rundown housing, public housing, that was turned around and created into the Olympic Village. So urban redevelopment and regeneration is another key legacy, because these have knock-on effects for the life in the city, and this part of the city specifically, post-Olympics. Fifth, economic legacies. Hosting the Olympics is thought to lead to considerable increases in key economic indicators. And here we get the neoliberal trickle-down effect, perhaps. This is what the IOC argue, that it increases economic activity and gross domestic product for various reasons. The building of the sites, the infrastructure developments, creates GDP, it increases economic activity and makes the economy more vibrant and more happening. It creates jobs, either through direct and indirect employment, directly through the manufacture or the making of the Olympics and the infrastructure, but also servicing the new forms of inhabitants and the new levels of inhabitants that come into these regenerated areas. They need services, they need shops, and people get employed through that indirectly in the building of these Olympic spaces. Growth in tourism sector, pathways to hosting other major events, and the significant economic impact and spending around the Olympics itself. So both in the short term and the long term there are significant economic legacies, so the IOC argue. And therefore, overall, what we can see then is the economics of the built spectacle are this: the refashioning the urban landscape for consumption is thought to produce real economic value. So all those various strategies that I just talked about here, from that through to this, are thought to produce real economic value for the host site. And this started off, the example of all this that came together was in 1992 and the Barcelona Olympics. That was probably the first example of a major regeneration and redevelopment of parts of a city for when hosting the games. And oftentimes we talk about the Bilbao effect. This is Bilbao. This is the Guggenheim Museum, designed by architect Frank Gehry, and it's thought to have led to the revival of the economic revival and the social revival, I would say, of Bilbao, the Spanish city, because it was there in this kind of post-industrial wasteland, and it's because of its iconic status as a fantastic symbol and building. Many people go there to Bilbao. Previously they would have never gone there, but because Gehry's Guggenheim is there, that's why they go there. So it symbolises the regeneration and the revival of this once industrial city into a space of consumption, here consuming Gehry's Bilbao. Well, similarly, there's a Barcelona effect, I would argue. And the Barcelona effect is very similar to the Bilbao effect. It's all about the regeneration and redevelopment of parts of the city as a result of hosting the Olympic Games. And specifically what we're talking about there is the redevelopment of this part on the coast, because they said that Barcelona was inward facing because they never developed this beachside, Mediterranean side part of the city, but having the Olympics there helped that redevelopment and helped to transform the city and this part of the city, and in many other ways helped to transform Barcelona into an important and highly visible tourist site as a result of the Olympic Games. So the Barcelona effect is the Olympic version of the Bilbao effect. Now I've got some other examples here and I'm not going to go over them, and I would point out there's a short video clip that you need to watch related to this. So the Barcelona effect is one legacy. The Sydney 2000 was a green legacy, an environmental legacy to the Games based around the remediation or reclamation of previously polluted land for the Olympic site at Homebush. And again, you need to look at the video clip and take all that in. Beijing 2004, the legacy was infrastructure revitalization. And they talk in various terms about that in this video clip. But one indication of this is look at this transformation in infrastructure in 4 years. Pre-Olympics, 3 lines, 64 stations in their underground. Post-Olympics, 8 lines, 192 stations. There's a clear knock-on benefit effect for that within Beijing, and in the video clips there. And there was a massive spectacular construction of a spectacular Beijing around the Olympics, and what Bruderho termed the conspicuous construction of an Olympic metropolis through the building of these iconic structures, I guess that's what we'd call them. And here they are. They're quite magnificent, and they do have a beneficial effect. There's perhaps a bit of a Barcelona effect going on, not only regenerating the city but making them sites that you'd want to visit because of their iconic status. So again, there's, what do I call it, infrastructure revitalization leading to a specific legacy for Beijing. Here we have Vancouver 2010 in this video clip speaking about the sustainable games, and they talk about hard and soft sustainable legacies, and this isn't hard and soft power, but this is the different way of thinking about hard and soft. Hard sustainable legacies are the building of the built environment, such as the Richmond Oval. Soft behavioural legacies soft sustainable legacies are behaviour and attitude. So they're harder to measure because you can see this, that's the hard legacy, it's there, it's an Olympic facility. But the attitudes and the behaviour of people are also thought to be a sustainable legacy, and increased mass participation post-Olympics was thought to be a discernible soft sustainable legacy for the Vancouver Olympics. And you need to think about these in relation to, if you choose to do this topic assignment, the bid that you choose. Do they talk about hard and soft sustainable legacies? They may not use those terms, but that's what they're referring to in that regard. And moving on, where are we going here? Next one, London 2012, which was the Legacy Games, and so much of it was generated by and the bid process and the bid ethos was all about its legacy and its various types of legacy, and it seemed to cover everything from sporting legacy through environmental, economic, social legacy. And the sporting legacy was key with London 2012. It was all about inspiring a generation to become more active, to become involved in sport. But as the bid film demonstrated from this video clip, it's not about inspiring British people to become more active. It was inspiring the world through the London Olympics to become more involved in physical activity, to be the next generation of athletes, and just to become more physically involved as part of your life. So if you see that, that's a clear example within this inspiration bid video, and it's thought to have had a big effect on why London got the games, because it was more than just about inspiring London, it was inspiring the world to be more active. But other forms of inspiration and legacy centred around London. Redevelopment was perhaps the key one, and it was centred in a part of London that was very much needed to be redeveloped. It was a very deprived, environmentally hazardous in many ways part of London, and economically was impoverished in many ways. And here we see Stratford town centre. You can't really tell there, but it was in 2004, before the Olympic development, it was a decaying inner city shopping area. After the Olympic development, you had Westfield Shopping Centre there, and it was, I think, the biggest shopping mall in Europe at the time, and a vibrant place to be. So it's a huge catalyst for redevelopment and economic regeneration. But as I said, here's the Fridge Mountain, and that Fridge Mountain was turned into the Olympic Stadium. And that's not a greatest picture of it there, but certainly the remediation of the environment, the pollutants, the various hazards on that land was certainly sorted out, and it was turned into a very appealing Olympic Park where the stadium was located. And so look at these. These are another forms of the urban redevelopment that were key to the success of the London bid, and in fact the London Games, you could argue, from turning a brownfield site into a 500-acre urban park, creating jobs, infrastructure improvements, 9,000 homes and affordable homes to be built, sporting amenities for the local community, and the Olympic effect contributing to the economic redevelopment of Stratford more generally. And here's an image from that, the Olympic Village under construction, which was going to transform the urban environment around there, and the Olympic Village was going to become part of the 9,000 affordable homes that were going to be created post-Olympics. So you can see London 2012 clearly legacy in many different ways. Now let's turn to Rio 2016 and talk briefly about Olympic legacy and urban transformation. As you know, Rio de Janeiro, located in the southern portion of Brazil, not the biggest city in Brazil, perhaps the most iconic city arguably within the Brazilian nation. And it got the Games in 2009, and the Games and the bid process and the successful bid was an important part of the then President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, commonly referred to as Lula. He's no longer the president, but he was then a very charismatic leader. Getting the Games and even bidding for the Games was an important part of his populist strategy. And this here is part of the bid film that was thought to be successful. The reason why the bid was successful was partly because of the way they positioned Rio, the Brazilian people within Rio, as a part and parcel of why the IOC should award the Games to Brazil. But that's as maybe. But what we need to think about is how, and you can see some interesting, I think it's quite an infectious video, it's quite good to look at. But the Olympics, as I say, was part of Lula's strategy, and it was a soft power strategy in many ways, getting back to what we were talking about in the previous topic, when we were talking about soft power and international relations. Because what he wanted to do, he wanted to assert Rio de Janeiro's world city status by securing the Games, but he also wanted to advance the image and reputation and influence of Brazil within the modern world. Similarly, by getting the Games, it was a statement on what Brazil was, and it would increase Brazil's soft power and influence and attractiveness around the world, if you remember what we were talking about there. But that's the external soft power, but there's also forms of internal soft power. This is where we're talking about Lula's political populism, because what Lula was doing was using the Olympics, as he used other parts of his policy and strategy, that were popular. So he was using the popular support generated by the successful hosting and securing of the World Cup, the Olympic Games, and Bolsa Familia as strategies that were very popular in the eyes of the Brazilian populace that would make him, his leadership, and his administration more generally popular as well. So here was a form of populism. Pick on popular strategies and policies that make you as a leader and an administration more popular. So you know what these two are. The Olympic Games, generally speaking, and the World Cup, successful bidding for those are popular strategies among the general populace. But as is Bolsa Familia, which was a policy to provide monies for those families at the lower end of the social ladder, so that it was a kind of social monetary intervention in people's lives that was, of course, popular for the millions of families in Brazil living in poverty. So these all linked into his form of political populism, of which the Olympic Games was perhaps the most clearest sporting example. And what the bid provided evidence was for the success of the bid was, and here's a political soft power, that the Brazilian model, Lula's mix of post-ideological mix of orthodox market economics, so a kind of neoliberal approach combined with progressive social policy, was the one to follow. So his populism, the success of the Olympic bid demonstrated the success and the appeal of his administration and his political ideology within his administration. But anyway, the Games was used and justified to the local population because, Rio, the city of Rio and the Brazilian government had to use billions, or will have to use billions of reai, I think they call, billions of public monies to fund this redevelopment. But it was justified because it would help accelerate the city's broader long-term aspirations, enhancing its social and physical fabric. So you can see they're already talking about legacy within the bid and as a justification to the people to get support for the bid. And here's an example of the type of regeneration that would go on, and it is quite remarkable, and it is quite costly. 36 billion Brazilian reai, I think that's how you say it, or $14.4 billion, which is a lot of money for a developing brick economy. But according to the organisers, the result of that investment will be this: Rio will become a greater global city and an even better place to live, do business and visit. So you can see how Rio is justifying its investment, its neoliberal investment, by the later short-term and long-term benefits that will trickle down, and how it's trying to remain competitive within inter-urban competition within the world system of cities. So you can see it's all going on what we talked about previously within this topic. But as I said, this is all about legacies, and what legacies do they focus on within this bid process? 4 mainly: the transformation of the city, social inclusion, youth and sport. So number 1, transformation. Some massive transformations are going to be brought about by this 14 billion investment that are sustainable long-term developments and legacies. This is what the argument is. Number 1, better air quality. Number 2, enhanced public transport. 3, improved security. And 4, creating the largest urban forest in the world as part of this process. And you can look at these in great detail. There's all the information on the web that you would need on this bid, and also on the ongoing transformation of the city. But here we have this high performance transport ring, which is the infrastructure, the transit infrastructure that's going to link the 4 sites of the Olympic Games through these different forms of enhanced mass transit. So that's one long-term benefit. And another big thing that it's part and parcel of is this regeneration projects. So rather like the Barcelona effect, various forms of regeneration and redevelopment of specific spaces within Rio are going to take place. Accommodation, entertainment and tourist district, housing, sport and recreation facilities and parks, all going on to regenerate and redevelop parts of the city. And here is an example. Olympic cities, I can't say that in Portuguese, and the quote is, "What was already good will become even better as a result of this transformation and this investment." So, second legacy, social inclusion, homes, training and jobs. It's going to directly improve housing, new apartments, more than 24,000 rooms around the game locations. Also linked to that, there are going to be various forms of professional and volunteer training that are going to improve the employability of people linked to the games as a result of their being involved with the games. There's going to be creation of these legacy villages, as number 1 says, that are going to house people, rather like the London model, that are going to provide enhanced forms of housing for the Rio population. Employment, they project 50,000 temporary and 15,000 permanent jobs that will be derived from direct and indirect forms of investment within the Olympics. Number 4 then is the procurement, and what they're trying to do with the 2016 Olympics is derive and source services and equipment locally as much as is possible, so there's a local knock-on social and environmental and economic benefit there. Youth and education is all about trying to link the Olympics to improvements in education generally and sport-related education and experiences as well. So there's these various programs, including this one, PEST, that are being rolled out to try and get youth specifically more involved in sport and physical activity. In addition, there's going to be a stimulation for participation in Olympic sports, so it goes from the lowest level to the highest level that are going to be derived from involvement in the games. And this links here to the sporting facilities and training facilities that are going to help to improve the level of Brazilian elite sport, from scholarships, training centre scholarships, legacy training facilities that are going to improve Brazilians' sport performance, the argument is, and these various things here. Federal investment in sport, those training facilities, and the training of officials. So all these legacies come directly from the bid document for the 2016 Games. So they were clearly positioning Rio in terms of the benefits, short-term and long-term, that these legacies would give to the city. So as you can see, as the mayor of Rio said at the time, it will be a game of legacies. He said their competitors, Madrid, Chicago and Tokyo, may seem in infrastructure terms to be more advanced, to be more prepared, but, quote, "But the games are held to unite the nations and transform the cities through which they pass. None of those cities would be transformed as Rio. This is an opportunity to change." So he's saying that all these various levels of legacy are going to bring about this revolutionary change within the Rio context. So that's why, quote, "It's the game of legacies." So you can see within Rio, as within many of the other games that are just touched upon since 1992, that legacy is clearly an important part of the bid process and of the actualizing and enacting and hosting the games. Whether or not those legacies actually come to fruition is another matter, but you can see that the IOC is clearly concerned that that's in place within the bid structure, that cities demonstrate the various forms of legacy that are going to be derived from hosting the games. But anyway, and Rio is just the latest and perhaps the best example that we can point to. And as I said, all that information is on the web. You're going to have to do a bit of digging around. Should you choose to do this topic assignment, you can choose a games, choose the bid information, choose the bid strategy of one games, and analyze it in relation to the various legacy strategies that they demonstrate or that they speak to. And I think that's quite an interesting thing to do. But anyway, in terms of a summary, Clearly, the Olympic Games are an important part of this interurban global competition, and as a result we've got this series of sport-based spectacular urban spaces have been created around the globe. But what you need to think about is they're done because they're thought to be motors of growth, social growth, economic growth, environmental growth, if you like. And what we need to do is think about how, and what we'll go on to think about is this. These are rooted in neoliberal assumptions about trickle-down economics and trickle-down influences, and so that's why it's a neoliberal model of the Olympics that has neoliberal trickle-down effects for the benefit of the rest of the population. Now, I'm not going to say whether I think that's a good or a bad thing, or whether it works or not, because in the next topic we're going to be thinking through and consider those anticipated benefits and whether or not they come to fruition and what some of the perhaps oppositions to them are. But what I want you to think about now, for now, and in this topic and certainly in the online discussion, is this. Simply, to what extent and in what ways are the contemporary Olympics, whether they're held in Barcelona, Atlanta, Sochi, Beijing, London, Vancouver, you name it, to what extent and in what ways are they in fact neoliberal? That's what I want you to think about. And by neoliberal, I'm also meaning post-industrial and also entrepreneurial. So in what ways are they that? That's what you need to consider, and that's what you need to think through in the online discussion. Okay, that's it. More again next time. See you then.